Hey folks, I'm JC from One Shot Adventures, and today I'm going to dive into the history of one of the quirkiest RPGs from the 1980s and 90s, Toon, the cartoon role-playing game. Toon let players take on the roles of wacky cartoon characters and participate in all kinds of loony adventures. And for many years, it was a favorite at game conventions where GMs would usually run it in very late night slots where everyone was very caffeinated, sleep deprived, and up for maximum zaniness. And Toon has two really interesting distinctions that make it worth talking about when it comes to RPG history. First, Toon was one of the very first rules light RPGs. Second, it was developed by one of the world's most famous video game designers. Intrigued? You should be. While Toon's been around for over 40 years, relatively unchanged, it largely faded into obscurity by the mid-2000s. But just a week or so ago, its publisher, Steve Jackson Games, recently announced a brand new version. Toon's second edition is coming out next year. So you might be curious, what was Toon? Where did it come from, and is it still worth playing today? Well, grab your anvils and oversized mallets and get ready to learn whatever happened to Toon. Toon was released in 1984 during a very interesting time of RPG history. Of course, it was a time when Dungeons and Dragons ruled RPGs, but RPGs were well into venturing into other genres. Just a few years prior, TSR had published their science fiction Star Frontiers game, and Chaosium had released Call of Cthulhu for horror. And that trend kept expanding. So by 1984, you'd see more settings getting depicted in RPG. That year, you saw the release of the Cold War Twilight 2000 and the Marvel superhero RPG. And joining them were two RPGs that were solidly aimed at something new: West End Games' kooky Paranoia game and Steve Jackson Games Toon. Toon was designed by Greg Kostickian, an up-and-coming game designer that would later go on to design the incredibly popular and influential Star Wars D6 RPG, which many fans argue, including myself, it's still the best incarnation of Star Wars in gaming. Strangely, Greg also helped to design Paranoia, that other game I mentioned, so it's fair to say that he was a thought leader in comedy role-playing. In fact, Greg attributed the origin of Toon to a conversation he had with a fellow game designer at Gen Con, who said to him, well, all obvious RPG genres have been done, except for Saturday morning cartoons, but of course you couldn't do that. But after a bit of thinking, Greg said to himself, wait a second, why couldn't you do that? And so he wrote up an early draft of Toon and sent it into Space Gamer, a gaming magazine owned by Steve Jackson. Steve liked Toon and handed it over to one of his staff, Warren Spector, a man who would later become famous in video games, designing and producing innovative classic storytelling games like Deus Ex, System Shock, Thief, Ultima, Wing Commander, and Epic Mickey. Apparently, and I can't confirm that this is true, but Warren's senior thesis was supposedly on the Looney Tunes cartoons. So it's safe to say that he loved cartoons as much as Greg. I actually got to enjoy Torchy's Tacos with Warren Spector once in Austin while brainstorming a Nintendo DS version of Epic Mickey, and I can say he's a really fun, nice guy who loves games so deeply, and he was great to hang out with. Toon was originally released in a slender 64-page book. The art was done by Kyle Miller, who just nailed the classic Warner Brothers look. Toon was 100% designed to recapture those classic slapstick cartoons. I'm talking Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Tom and Jerry, Popeye, and other wacky cartoons from, say, the late 50s to the early 1980s. If something could get hit by an anvil and walk away, Toon was designed to handle that. Ah! I'm good. You'll see why in a minute. The game was very light for the era, although I think it would still be considered pretty light today. Well, maybe rules medium light. Characters had 4 attributes: muscle, zip, smarts, and chutzpah. which was all about your attitude. You'd roll a 6-sided die to generate each stat, and then you'd roll another die plus 6 for your hit points. So there was plenty of randomness in character creation. You'd then distribute 30 points to 23 skills that Toon had, which were all associated with one of those attributes. So, for example, if you had a muscle of 5 and you could add 2 skill points to your breakdown doors skill, well, you'd have a breakdown doors of 7. Skills all work the same way. To use a skill, just roll 2 dice and try to roll equal to or under your skill. So you'd be breaking down doors on a roll of 7 or less. Hey, that felt pretty good. The skills are fairly standard for an RPG. Things like climb, fight, ride, and sneak. They were very extreme versions of these skills. So for example, if you succeeded a fast talk roll, your foe would automatically do one very stupid thing that you suggested, like walk off a cliff. There were also a few unusual skills thrown in to reflect the genre, like cover tracks, pass off shoddy goods, or my favorite, identify dangerous thing. Oh, thank you, a present! There were 2 quirks with the system. Not all skills were created equal, so you'd sometimes see players dumping a lot of points into the really useful skills like fight and fast talk, and none in swim or read. And 2d6 has a big bell curve, so if you had a 2 or 3 in a skill, just don't plan on ever succeeding. But if you had a 9, well, you'd rarely fail. You could also spend some of those points on 1 or 2 shticks, powers your Toon could use. Again, these were all pulled straight from the Looney Tunes Acme catalog and range from things like bags of many things, hypnosis, flying, shape-changing, super luck. But even then, all these shticks you'd have to roll against to pull them off. And it started pretty low for those, so there were a lot of funny failures built right into the game system, trust me. You could play any species you wanted, and there were plenty of silly tables to inspire you. You'd also set a belief or goal that drove your character, and off you went. Character creation really only took about 10 minutes. Toon really didn't have that many more rules outside of using skills. For example, a fight was just a roll-off of the 2 skills with the winner doing 1d6 damage to the other. And in fact, Toon had a really cool innovative mechanic that I liked, which is if you ever hit 0 hit points, you wouldn't die or be knocked out. You would just go off screen for 3 minutes and then waltz back in just fine. While Toon was mostly played as one-shots, there was a system to advance characters from session to session. GMs, or animators as Toon called them, could hand out plot points after adventures, and plot points were used to increase skills or buy one-shot abilities. A modern gamer might be surprised that plot points weren't used to boost important roles or alter the narrative or take control of a scene, which would have been perfect for a cartoon role-playing game, but give Toon a break. Those kinds of metagaming systems hadn't yet been invented in 1984. But what really made Toon amazing was that it was chock full of GM advice on how to pull off everything you've ever seen in a cartoon. For example, there was an illogical logic rule where characters could ignore physics by simply failing a smarts roll. Wanna walk off a cliff? Well, just fail a smarts roll and keep walking. You're not smart enough to be affected by gravity. And yes, this does mean canonically, Wile E. Coyote was smarter than the Roadrunner, which is why he always fell. There were guidelines for shadows coming to life to annoy you, instant fine print appearing on the bottom of contracts, portable holes with trains running through them, sawing branches from the wrong way on a tree, just about everything you've ever seen on TV. And the game was written in a funny, breezy way that was unusual for RPGs of the time. And it included 4 complete adventures, most of which were written by Warren Spector and could be run in just a couple hours. You can tell it was a very complete game, even in its earliest incarnation. And that paid off because Toon had a very successful launch. Even the earliest reviews from 1984 almost universally loved it, and they called out its innovation. One reviewer wrote, "Toon is a genuinely good idea, an original, if unlikely, concept in role-playing." Another wrote, "Toon is a quick cure for all your role-playing ills." Toon's success meant that it was followed by 3 supplements: Silly Stuff, Toon Strikes Back, and Son of Toon, which all added more stuff to the game, like new shticks, rules for gizmos, more silly tables, and lots of new adventures. By 1990, folks were already calling Toon a classic. And then in 1991, it was all combined into the deluxe edition of Toon, which pulled it all together and gave you more than 200 pages of cartoon madness. Trust me, more than you could ever use. But the deluxe edition wasn't the end of Toon. It still stayed popular. And as ridiculously complete as the game was in that book, it was followed by 3 more giant-sized supplements, each over 200 pages. And this time, though, they were all written by a new writer, Robert Doc Cross, who steered the RPG into full-on parody and genre exploration mode. 1992's Tooniversal Tour Guide was the first, and it doubled down on parodies, bringing Toon full-on into other genres, including a lot that were aimed directly at RPG fans. Dungeons and Toons with spell rules, The Crawl of Cthulhu, which is horror for Toon characters, Toonpunk 2020 and a half, and the Car Wars parody Cartoon Wars. This was a fun book, although, to be honest, I didn't find it especially useful. I just didn't know who was running a Toon game and was excited to really focus on a genre that in itself was a parody of another RPG. That's a strange Venn diagram of players if you ask me, but the tour guide was more fun and silliness for Toon. And this was then quickly followed by another supplement, 1993's Toon Tales, which included 3 more big settings and adventures: Toon Fu for martial arts, Way Out West, and Crime and Toonishment. And no, that wasn't a Dostoevsky parody, that was a full-on noirish detective setting for Toon. And finally, 1994 saw the release of the Toon Ace catalog. And this is one of my favorite supplements because it's a giant shopping catalog of every cartoon gizmo and gadget you can imagine. Think the Acme catalog from the Roadrunner cartoons, the thing that Wile E. Coyote would always order crazy stuff from. Things like exploding anvils, nuclear-powered pogo sticks. They were just so much fun inside the Ace catalog. And like Doc Cross was fond to do, it even went into weirder areas having to do with other genres. Like there were things in there for mechs and robots and starships and even whole towns you could buy. There was one other small release for Toon years later in 2006, a small PDF-only Toon Munchkin, which was an expansion for both Toon and the Dungeons and Toon setting from the Tooniversal Tour Guide. It brought more silly spells and monsters to the game based on the popular game. But for all intents and purposes, Toon ended in the mid-1990s and mostly disappeared from RPG consciousness by the mid-2000s. While it went out of print, Steve Jackson Games kept it alive in PDF form, and Toon, you'd see, would frequently turn up on people's lists of recommendations for great RPGs for kids, which I agree with. I ran Toon for my son. It was one of his very first RPG experiences, and his friends when they were very young, and they had a blast fighting an evil refrigerator. I remember it pretty vividly, and so does he. But now, 40 years after its release, Toon is getting a new edition, a second edition, revised by Steve Jackson himself. And that's pretty crazy if you think about RPGs that get new editions every 40 years. We don't know everything about it, but it's going to be available in full color, feature faster character creation rules, have a little bit more on cartoon history, and be chock full of more silly charts and adventures. I'm a big fan of the faster character creation it mentioned. I always thought it was a little bit weird that you'd roll for your attributes in Toon, but then go on to a more detailed skill-by-skill, point-by system. And it sounds like they'll include a system that removes randomness entirely. Maybe it'll just be numbers you assign, which would be great. I personally hope that it also includes a fully random option. It just feels right in a cartoon role-playing game, doesn't it? They also said that they'll revise the falling down rules to be losing 3 actions versus being out for 3 minutes, which is fine. I think they both work. And they'll expand plot points to be more freewheeling, but mostly very, very light rules revisions. Toon broke a lot of ground in the early days of RPGs. It was one of the first games where you could explain the rules in under a minute, and it didn't take itself so seriously like so many games were doing. And it was truly a love letter to the genre it was trying to emulate. You couldn't help but reading that book and nodding, yes, this is the game that Yakko, Wacko, Dot, and the rest of the Warner Brothers crew would be playing at their table. But with Toon, the question always comes up, who is it for? Is it for kids? Well, yeah, it works great for kids, like I said before. Is it for adults? I've had some of my best gaming experiences running Toon at conventions for adults. It's familiar, it's easy, and everyone just gets it. Is it for everyone? Absolutely not. You have to be in the mood for zaniness and not mind ignoring physics and mechanics that occasionally feel a little bit more rigid than the genre it's trying to emulate, like today's standards anyway. And people also ask, is Toon a game designed for one specific type of cartoon genre? Old Saturday morning cartoons. After all, cartoons have evolved a lot since 1984. Even a few years later in the 80s, cartoons were conquered by the likes of He-Man, G.I. Joe, Transformers, and then that evolved into The Simpsons and South Park, and then SpongeBob and Rick and Morty and Bob's Burgers and Invincible. And well, you get the idea. Cartoons aren't just one thing anymore. But at its core, Toon is a fairly generic RPG for any silly genre. Could you do something like Rick and Morty or SpongeBob in Toon? You 100% could, but you'd want to tweak some of those skills and shticks. For example, SpongeBob absolutely needs a cooking Krabby Patties skill and an annoy other skill or shtick. Squidward needs something to cover his music skill, albeit at a very low skill level. Toon, fortunately, is very easy for a GM to tweak. You can just add those skills or shticks in like a few minutes. And similarly, I don't think Toon is just for cartoons. I think you could run any silly game with it. I might pick Toon for a one-shot of a What We Do in Shadows RPG, or even a Curb Your Enthusiasm RPG. But ultimately, Toon is best with cartoon silliness. The more you venture out of that, the more likely another RPG will do it a little better. I wouldn't run He-Man with Toon. You could, but again, there's probably better RPGs for that. But for classic cartoons and slapstick and sheer goofiness, Toon still can't be beat. And I'm backing that new crowdfunding campaign, which, by the way, as a disclaimer, Steve Jackson Games didn't pay me for this video and didn't talk to me about this. I just love Toon, so I'm excited for this new edition. Although I will always keep my worn out Red Book Deluxe version proudly on my shelf. If you enjoyed this little deep dive into RPG history and want to see more videos like it, hit that like and subscribe button. And if you've played Toon, let me know in the comments below what your experience was like. I expect the stories to be wascally. Until next time, I'm JC, and just remember, oh, that's all, folks.